Jari is a network scientist working in Aalto University in Helsinki. He received his PhD in applied physics in '98, studying quantum crystals. And after some career twists and turns involving technology companies and what we would call data science nowadays, he returned to academia to study complex networks, a new and rapidly expanding field at that time. And he's been closely involved in developing the field and probably best known for his work on social and temporal networks. But his broad range of research interests has also included topics from ant supercolonies to the human immune system, which demonstrates interestingly how far and wide-reaching and dare I not say universal features we're dealing with here. So without further ado, Jari, the mic is yours.
Okay, thanks, Matti. I'll just turn the screen sharing on. So you are now supposed to see my screen, am I right?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Jari Saramäki. I'm a physicist turned network scientist, and I thought that I'll try to present an overview today on how things spread on the networks that we are all embedded in. So the starting point is this, that we are all embedded in a number of networks. So one could even think that we are embedded in a network of networks that spans the entire planet through social connections, through online connections, so that everyone is connected to everyone else. And this network and its multiple layers transmit different types of things, from information to misinformation, to rumors, to opinions, to worldviews, to contagious patterns of behavior, things that we don't even realize that we have caught from the network. And then also contagious disease, which is, of course, today extremely relevant. And I thought that I'll give a sort of, I'll try to zoom out from the perspective of individual nodes or people in networks towards the scale of the entire network, focusing on certain network features that I have myself studied during my career in networks. And we'll first get started by thinking a bit about modeling spreading, modeling contagion. So what's required if you want to somehow quantify the dynamics of something that people catch from other people, whether it's information, whether it's rumors, whether it's behavior, or whether it's a disease. So you basically need two ingredients, right? You need first a mathematical model of whatever it is that's doing the spreading. And then you need to know who can transmit it to whom, because not everyone is in touch with everyone else, right? So we'll first talk a bit about the first part, and then we'll spend most of the time in the second part of trying to understand who can transmit things to whom. So let's get started from models of disease, the SIR model, which is a very traditional, important, simple epidemiological model of contagious disease, and also old. Basically, in this model, people who would be nodes in a network are in one of discrete states, which is very typical for modeling any processes of spreading or contagion, that the people are placed in some classes that are discrete. So you either are sick or not, you have heard the rumor or you haven't heard the rumor, or you have recovered from disease or not. So these are binary discrete. And in the SIR model, we have the typical ingredients of disease, that one can be susceptible to disease, which means that you don't have it yet, but if in contact with someone who's infectious, you can get it with some probability beta. And then if you are unlucky enough to get sick, you typically recover or are removed from the system by immunity or death with some rate mu. So this is the progress of a single individual person through the states of the disease. And this has been applied to in many different contexts, and really it's an old model from about 100 years ago or so. And if you write that down as equations, and then you assume something about who is in contact with whom, and then you solve the equations, you get dynamics like this, which we are all too familiar with now through the COVID pandemic, that you get something that grows exponentially, and then maybe at some point the wave of the epidemic starts going down because you run out of susceptibles in this case. So you get curves like this that tell about the dynamics. But if you want to model something else, what would be your approach? It has been realized a long time ago already, in the 60s, that if you think of information or rumors and you think through the mathematics, it looks pretty much the same, right? So you can basically just take the SIR model and recast it in the terminology of rumor spread, so that you are susceptible if you haven't heard the rumor, you are infectious if you're actively spreading a rumor that you heard, and then you are recovered or removed when you get bored of the whole thing and no longer spread the rumor. So this exactly maps to the SIR model. And then of course you can have more complicated cases and more details, but in essence, it's sort of easy to see that these processes are very much alike. And this is sort of a really general thing. So if you have a population where some things are contagious, it doesn't really matter what those things are. The mathematics is pretty much similar on a high enough level. When you go down to the details, there are of course differences, but the big picture remains the same. And then, just for the sake of completeness, I'll mention a third type or second type of model, which is so-called complex contagion. And this only applies to things like opinions or behaviors or things like this, not to disease, because here to get infected or to change your opinion on something, you need to have input from multiple sources. So, for example, you would switch your political opinion if a high enough fraction of your network neighborhood, of your friends, have a certain opinion. Then perhaps you would succumb to peer pressure and you would change your opinion to match with that. So you need to have multiple inputs, which is, by the way, not too different from how the neurons in our brains work, which are also part of a network that does things. But let's not go that way. Let's stick to the more simple case here. Okay, but now we have some idea of how you would model contagion. So you have nodes in discrete states, and their states change through the states of because of the states of their neighbors, and then through time, so that once you are infectious, in the end you will recover or die or just stop spreading the rumor. So that's the basics. Now let's then look at the other part, the sort of more interesting part in my view, which is that, okay, so this is how things work, but now we need to know who are the network neighbors of nodes, who can transmit whatever it is that is spreading to whom, and how can we look at the structure, and what effects does that structure have on the spreading process. So, well, the starting point is that it's networks that determine who can transmit X to whom, whatever X is. And you can now think of several types of networks, or several layers of a big multi-layer network that transmit different types of things. You can have purely online networks, or Twitter, Facebook, whatever is the fashion amongst the young people today. And those networks are a bit different from offline or real world networks, in that very often the relationships in those networks are one way. So if someone is really famous and has tons of Twitter followers, then usually that's a one-way street. It's like broadcasting to a large audience. It's not a two-way street. They can't follow what all their followers are doing. But in sort of real world offline networks, that's kind of the definition, right? That social ties are two-way ties in a way. So we know people, they know us, we have a sort of mutual understanding of the situation. Both of us know something about the other person. So it's a two-way street. So family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, so on. And then we have, for disease spreading, a third type, which is networks of contacts, of physical proximity, that partially mirror those social ties. So we meet with the people we know, right? But we also are in the proximity of strangers. So if I'm on a subway train, I sit next to people who are not part of my social network. But then probably I'm headed to work, where I meet people who are part of my social network, my colleagues, whom I know. So contact networks are partially mirror the networks of social ties. So we have different types of networks, different layers of networks. Some transmit information, some transmit behavior, some transmit disease. And so let's ask, how do the properties of those networks affect this spreading of things, or transmission, or influence? And I thought that it would be fun to sort of do the following exercise that I have not done myself before. I did this just for this talk, that I start from the micro level, individual nodes, individual people, and then I start zooming out to bigger and bigger and bigger structures. And I see, what can I say about the network properties at different levels. And I'll be focusing on certain network properties that I know well, that I've studied, so that I can also talk about some empirical results here. But so let's start from nodes, people, because we are talking about people here. So people are the nodes of a network. They are connected by links, and links can be social ties or online ties or proximity ties. And we can always, for every person, we can count how many of those links they have. Well, this is actually an abstraction we need to, we'll come back to this. It's not this simple, but let's keep things simple first. So we have a network, everyone has X network neighbors. The number X is called their degree in a network. And so it's sort of obvious that if things move through the network, if things spread through the network, if the network transmits something, then the more links I have, then if it's influence, the more influence I can exert. If it's information, the more information I can receive and also pass the information on to more others. Or if it's a network of contacts, then I'm at risk. I get sick more often if I have more contacts. And I also am a risk, because I can then pass the disease on to others more often. Right? So that's like the micro level view. One person and the surrounding network of friends or colleagues and strangers on a bus, and so. So let's then think of this and focus now on the sort of real social ties, ties where people know each other's faces and names and can tell something about the other. And let's first talk about the number of such connections. So how many links can we have? How many social ties can we have? Are there some constraints? Are there some limits of that? Now, some of you might have heard about the so-called Dunbar's number, which is a theory proposed by Robin Dunbar of Oxford University, where he states that the personal network size of humans is thought to be about 150 falters, 150 network neighbors, friends, colleagues, family members, acquaintances, so on. And there, the idea is that if you look at our closest relatives, other primates, and if you look at their social group size, if you look at their neocortex size, then and extrapolate a bit, you would see that, okay, for humans, then this number should be about 150. Now, of course, it's difficult to define what network size means. So who's in your network, who's not. But still, the argument is this makes, of course, a lot of sense. And we can even think of a simple way to prove that there must be a limit, which is that you just think of, do you know anyone who has 10,000 friends? Or have you ever heard of anyone who has 10,000 friends? And obviously, of course, the answer is no, there can't be such people. And why can't there be such people? If you start thinking through that, then you realize that, okay, I mean, you wouldn't even be able to remember 10,000 other people, right? And you would never have the time that you would require to maintain so many social ties. Ergo, there must be a cap on the number of people in your social network that depends both on your brain power, memory, and the time available for maintaining those social ties. And then whether it's exactly 150 or 175, or how it depends on how you define social times is sort of not as important. But clearly there's a cap. Okay, so we are at the point where we know that nodes, the people, have different numbers of neighbors, and this number is limited from above to some limit. But are all of those people equal? So are all of my social ties the same? Or do I interact equally often with every single one of my network neighbors? Obviously, the answer is no, that's not how the world works. We know that we have certain close people, family members, and then we have others with whom we interact far less frequently and who are far less close to us. And this is something that we actually studied together with Robin Dunbar and a number of other people at Oxford a few years back. We looked at a situation where we had an experimental setting where there was a number of students who finished high school and then went on to gap year or universities in other cities. And we followed how their social networks evolved. And we had mobile phone call data so that we knew every call they had made and had a timestamp for it, or we knew whom they had called and had a timestamp for the call. So we could count how many calls they placed to different people. And through that, we could see how their social networks evolved in time. And the analysis we did with this data was that we computed so-called social signatures, where we take a person, one of the students, we take everyone they have called, we count the number of calls to that person, and then we rank those people on the basis of this number of calls and see what fraction of calls goes to number one, number two, so on. So you get a pattern that tells you how heavily you emphasize your closest friends or family members in terms of calls, if you take call frequency as a sort of proxy of social tie strength. And what we found out in this experiment was that there's a very typical pattern that everyone follows, which is that you have very, very large numbers of calls concentrated at the top ranks. So the people who are closest to you receive a very, very big share of your attention. And this, it doesn't really depend on who those people are, because some students' social networks underwent big turnover, so their old friends got replaced by newcomers, but still this pattern remained. So people tend to structure their personal network so that you have a small number of really close people and larger and larger numbers of people who are not that close. And now if you think again of how networks transmit influence, or networks transmit information, then you are far more in touch with this top subset of your network, right? So even though you have a high degree, a high number of others, then in a typical social setting, you are still influenced by a handful of people that transmit the stuff that the network transmits to you, right? And this is rather relevant for spreading in general, both information and contagious disease. Okay, so we have the picture where we have ex-neighbors, subset of those neighbors, or strong ties with a subset of those neighbors. Now let's zoom out a bit. Let's start doing the zooming that I mentioned, and look at how those ties, those strong ties, are placed in the network. Can we say something beyond the egocentric network of one person? And that's another study that we did like way back in 2007, which dealt with so-called weak ties hypothesis of Mark Granovetter, which basically is a hypothesis of how tie strength relates to network structure. And the point is simply that if you have a strong tie, you can expect more common network neighbors. So you have a close friend, then probably you have many common friends. That's what it tells you. We tested the same thing again with call data, this time a bit more than 24. We had 7 million people and metadata on their mobile phone calls, anonymized, high quality data. And of course, you can construct a network where people are nodes and links are determined by calls, their weights are numbers of calls, and then you can test this. And we saw that it clearly holds, so that these strong ties have many triangles around them. Strong ties imply many common friends. So now that means that there are actually sort of clusters of strong ties in your network, right? So we have people who have a certain number of friends out of, or network neighbors out of those certain number of strong ties, and the strong ties of different people tend to be clustered together in social groups. And the weaker ties then must lead outside those groups. Now, this structure is of enormous importance for spreading or transmission in networks, because now if you think that the strong ties are also associated with higher contact frequency, that means that they transmit things far more often than the weaker ties, and they tend to be in clusters. So if you take the same data and you simulate the spreading process, one of those simple models that I had in the beginning, something even simpler, maybe just SI, so you are susceptible until you meet with an infected, and then you become infectious yourself, and that's that, you never recover. That would be a process of just information transmission, that you hear something, then you know it, and then you tell that to others. If you run that process on top of a network like this that has clusters of strong ties, then you see that the spreading process tends to stick to those clusters. They sort of pin the spreading front, because, well, that's how the maths goes. I call you very often, then you hear the thing from me, you call some of our common friends very often, then they hear the same thing, and then calls to outside this group happen less frequently. So the information tends to stick inside the group. And this is actually something that is also very relevant for contagious disease, because if we have contact networks that have the same feature, that there are repeated contacts among a small group of people, and those contacts are clustered, and if you have a disease that requires prolonged exposure to be transmitted, like COVID is in most cases, except for the super spreading events and super spreaders, then you get a disease that kind of lives in clusters. It sticks to clusters. And that's simply because it kind of feels out, it maps out the structure of the underlying contact network. Right. So the structure of tie strengths matters a lot, how those ties are clustered in networks. And now, if this is the picture, strong ties are in groups, then where are the weak ties? Well, the only place that's left for them is between the groups. And then that means that weak ties are still of tremendous importance, because if you would remove them, your network would break down into clusters that are separate, that are no longer connected together, and then nothing could spread through the network. It would anything that would be spreading would infect the first sort of cluster of strong ties and remain there forever, because there would be no ways out. those weak links are the ways out. And if I would need to speculate on COVID, the weak ties are super spreading events, right? So things where the disease sort of hops between tight clusters. And this is, of course, the world is not this binary. This is an exaggeration, but the role is still the same. That you have events that bring the spreading thing outside the network neighborhood where it currently is, and it jumps to other parts of the network. Then let's still zoom out. Let's go up to the level of the whole network. So we have had nodes, links, social groups, links between groups, and now look, let's have a bird's eye view on the whole network. And how do the properties of the whole network affect spreading processes or information transmission processes? Well, it's really well known in network science and in complexity sciences that the degrees, the numbers of connections that nodes have are really highly heterogeneous in almost all types of networks that exist. But here there are, when we talk about networks of people, there are major differences. If you have things like Twitter, there is no cap on the number of Twitter followers that someone can have. Super high degrees exist. So someone can be really famous. There is no process that makes it more difficult to start following that person, right? So there is no limiting process. That's a one-way street. It's more like broadcasting. But these hubs exist, and they have huge implications on how things transmitted through Twitter, because if you are one of those hubs and you say something, then you get millions of eyeballs, right? But you don't hear back from all of your followers, so it's a one-way street. If you have offline network like the real world, then you can't have as high degrees. As I already mentioned through this Dunbar idea, there are always limitations, time, mental capacity. Then if we talk about contact networks, how heterogeneous are degrees? That's a bit more unknown. Those are actually contact networks which would be crucial for understanding what's going on in the world right now, are rather, they are not well studied at all. There are only a handful of high quality data sets with N in the hundreds. So, for example, the simple question of how many close contacts does a typical person have during the day is something that no one knows the answer to. It's not known. It has never been measured. There have been no large-scale measurements of this thing, which is because it's fairly difficult to do so. One could do that now with all the COVID tracking apps with Bluetooth proximity, except that for privacy reasons, they have been all the data they collect has been sort of totally hidden and made secure so that this information can't be extracted out of them. There is one data set that uses Bluetooth, which I'm working on, which I'll come back to in a bit, that has been collected from volunteer students. But this is an important thing, and it's really ill studied. Okay, then, well, just to make sort of things complete, I'll mention something that every network scientist knows, that if you have this broad distribution or this high level of heterogeneity in the degrees of nodes, that affects spreading processes in a very big way, because it makes your networks really vulnerable to spread. It also makes them really vulnerable to node removal, so you can stop the spread if you just take out the hubs, the high degree nodes. And that's a common feature of networks. Then, just for the sake of completeness, I will mention some network properties that are sort of a mixture of a node's properties and the whole network, because you need to know the whole network in order to understand, in order to even compute those properties. You have different centralities. For example, if you have two parts of a network and then you have one single node that joins these two parts of the network, that node would have a super high betweenness centrality, because all the paths from one part of the network would need to go through that node. And then obviously it's really important for any spreading process. If you take that node out, then spreading stops between the two parts of the network. So there are network features that are sort of associated with individual nodes as well. And then finally, before I run out of time, I'll mention a different dimension, which is what I have been studying for the last years, which is also really important, and that is manifest at the level of networks. So if you have data that has timestamps, and you use that to construct networks where the links are not on, but they are only on at certain points in time, like mobile phone calls can transmit information only when the call takes place. Or if you have proximity or contact networks where you really track the time evolution of the contacts, that persons A and B are in contact now, but then like an hour later, person B is in contact with person C, and you track the time evolution, this changes the whole picture. It makes the network picture more complicated, and it brings you a ton of different network features that you can try to understand and look at. And many of them have crucial implications for spreading dynamics. I'll not go into this whole zoo of temporal network animals that are out there, but I'll mention one of them, which is burstiness of contacts that's typical for human communication networks like mobile phone calls or emails, which goes as follows: that if I look at when I send an email or make a call with a friend of mine or a relative of mine, and I look at the time series, then typically it's so that there are long gaps where nothing happens, and then there will be many calls or emails, and then again long gaps, and then many calls or emails. So it's the events are clustered in time, separated by long gaps, and that makes information spreading slower than if one would be in uniform contact at all points in time. But there are many things that change spreading dynamics in networks, and this is something that's a very active area of study for the time being, and a very important area, because if you apply all these things to contact networks, if we had enough data on contact networks, we would have a far better idea of how COVID, for example, spreads. And I'll just mention how such things can be studied, for example, through mobile phone data collected from Bluetooth contacts from tracking apps installed to volunteer people's phones, so that you can get timelines of contacts, and then you can put some really elaborated state models of spreading on top of that contact network, and then you can study various things, how certain interventions or contact tracing or tracing app use would change the situation. And to do so, you really need to have the contact network, because many things that are done to fight COVID actually take place at the level of the contact network. You make interventions to the network. You can make blunt interventions like a lockdown, so the network disappears, everyone is at home. Or you can do sort of more nuanced interventions like contact tracing. So you figure out where the disease is spreading, and then you take out those nodes and remove them temporarily from the network by placing them into quarantine. So that's a network level intervention, and there's a lot to be studied here, and this is a super active field of research at the time being. But so now to have a bit of time for questions, I'll conclude here, and we'll basically take home message here is that whatever type of spreading, network structure plays a major role in how we are influenced by others, what information we receive, and how we get sick. And this is not just our immediate network neighborhood, like how many people we meet, but it also matters where we are in the network, and how our group of people is related to other groups of people in the network, and what the centrality of us is in the network. And there's a lot to be understood here. So this is a very rich area of study, and a very active area of study at the time. And I'll stop here for questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jari. Excellent presentation. Nelly is again clapping because she's conditioned to clap every time after a presentation. So
clapping with, so visually clapping with the microphone. Thank you, Nelly.
yes, so there's a question in particular based on yesterday's research on complex phenomena. I wonder if the infectious disease model oversimplifies the social contact information transfer model, even when focusing the rumors, but especially when you have to gain the behavior change by data or information you are transmitting. I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Sarmita, could you unmute Pirjo Juvonen-Posti so she might be able to ask clarify the question?
Hello, everybody. This is Pirjo Juvonen-Posti.
Hi.
I asked this because I have this medical background.
Mm-hmm.
I know something about you, what you told about the basic model, but it's but because I have been studying now for years complex phenomenon called work-related rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
I was really interested in yesterday's discussions about that how our traditional thinking models of testing and showing out the outcomes by linear models can lead us to totally false thinking and false outcomes, as discussed during the latest lecture yesterday. And that's why I was challenging you, Jari, a little bit of that when you started with, for me, quite a simply model of how you get infectious disease from another. If that is as a basic model of your thinking, oversimplifying, because the data you are showing is of course more complex and tells us about the more complex features of contacting socially. And when you went to the contacting via apps and phones and so on, how much does this simply model of getting a contact explains, how much does it explain of those features you just showed us from your data? Thank you.
Okay, I was not part of yesterday's discussion, so it's a bit hard for me to understand the question. But nevertheless, if we talk about, let's talk about two things. First, these simple models. So the models that I mentioned here are super simple, and I would also call these toy models in that things are never as simple, even for disease. They are never as simple as for the SIR model. You need to have, if you really want to, you need to get down to something that's far more complicated, with far more compartments, with far more features. So the toy models of both disease spreading and also rumor spreading or social influence are simple because they are then a bit more tractable, and you can a bit better understand how things happen and how network features, for example, influence things. So this is the typical approach by physicists, that if you would want to model an atom, then I don't know, you start with one big hard sphere and then this tiny sphere that sort of flies around it. We of course know through quantum mechanics that that's not how atoms are at all, but that's a starting point that gets you somewhere in your understanding. And these so-called toy models of spreading are exactly that. So you learn the big picture by doing something pretty simple. Now, when it comes to models of rumors and social influence, then actually there's much beyond these super simple things that I mentioned as an introduction. And for example, already these models of more complex contagion, where you kind of receive input from many of the people in your network change this thing a lot. And so it has been shown in empirical research by Damon Centola, for example, that you, in an online system, you adopt health behaviors more often if many of your network neighbors have adopted that, but then it starts saturating at some point. So if 5 of my network neighbors have done something, then if the 6th does, it doesn't really change things that much anymore for what I do. But yeah, everything is a simplification, and that's usually how you get started with things. This is how I would put it. But I don't know the context of yesterday's discussion, so if someone else can relate to that, then please.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question, many thanks, Jari, for the really interesting talk. Can network analysis be used to look at the spread of different interrelated things? For example, could one look at how climate change beliefs affect different kinds of pro-environmental actions and vice versa at the micro level?
Absolutely. And then usually when we talk about such things, then the issue is data, right? So, and then it also depends on what level of detail you want to do the modeling, or whether you want to do theoretical work where you kind of assume certain types of network structures and certain types of propagation models and all that, or whether you want to do data-driven work, which might be really difficult, so that you actually have data on people's beliefs and actually have data on how people did something, right? So how something that spreads on the network has real world outcomes. And usually this data is the bottleneck in my view.
This, and how do you collect data for network analysis in a non-intrusive ethical manner? So the context could be, for example, the field of organizational network analysis, which is evolving and coming into proeminence in organizational design, with quite a lot of dilemmas on how to collect data about the interactions between employees.
This I can really understand, and now we are entering a more difficult territory than the things that I've been talking about here. We've used mobile telephone data that has been collected in experiments with volunteers in settings that where they are in settings that are a bit different from the workplace, for example, so that you don't need to be worried about someone actually judging you on the basis of what you do in the network, or following you or tracking you. And then we have used big anonymized data sets coming from telephone operators, where you have millions of people whose identities have simply been stripped away. So we just know that A has been in touch with B. But when you go to something like this, then there are tons of technologies that you can use. You can track emails in a company. You can place RFID sensors. You can have people wear RFID sensors so that you can get a contact network of them in a workplace, as people in the social patterns project have done. But that more like for the context of contagious disease, so that you know how people interact, and then you can simulate disease on top, and then you can maybe propose to companies some ways of changing the contact structure to make it more safe. But yeah, this is a really difficult area, and I don't have much experience in that.
Yeah, I remember one study where they made all the employees wear a necklace that had some sort of a camera that recorded both the voice and video.
I can sort of see the problems there, yes.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Many thanks for the inspiring talk. I love your description of clusters pinning the spreading front. I find you were describing how a cellular James Conway game of life type of state change actually happens in social life. If that were the case, there could be some cyclicality or self-replication happening with the epidemic spreading pattern. It might be possible to find some temporal social regularity in epidemic spreading instead of epidemic spreading due to contextual weather conditions or social conditions. So would you have any comments on the patterns and repeating regularity due to the social structure?
Right, but so if you think of the sort of game of life context where you switch pixels on and off, right? Then yeah, okay, then fine. For disease, then you would have a model called SIS or SIRS, so that you don't have long-lasting immunity, you have only short-lasting immunity, and once you have recovered, then eventually you become susceptible again. And if you place that on a network, then you get all sorts of really rich patterns. You don't even have to have any seasonality like in sunlight or temperature or whatnot affects the spreading. You just take a network, you place SIS or SIRS on top of the network, and with right parameters, you get the oscillations in the network structure. And then in the real world, probably for certain diseases, it's that plus sort of phase locking onto the yearly cycle, plus actually for some diseases you have new people every year. Yeah, you have kids who grow up, and then you have people dying. So even the population changes, and that combined with disease mechanics, combined with the environment that sort of provides a way of phase locking the cycle to yearly or biannual or other cycles. Yes, that's the thing. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the inspiring talk. You're not on the Slack channel of ours, are you?
Nope.
Okay.
Send me a link. Or admin,
yes,
or whatever you do with Slack.
Okay, I will send you an invitation. There might be some questions. We have a channel for network structures, so it would be great if you could join the discussion for a little while.